So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." And when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." And the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to the law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate heard the statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to a place called the Place of the Skull, which in Aramaic is Golgotha. And there they crucified him, with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. And Pilate also wrote in an inscription and put it on the cross, and it read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." And when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier, and also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the scripture which said, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home. And after this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the scriptures, "I thirst." A jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
Thank you, Wendy, for reading that text for us this evening. The singing was great. Just so grateful to sing praises with you tonight and remember what Christ has accomplished for us. You know, when you come to the end of maybe a competition or really just the end about anything, that really can be the time when it becomes most dangerous. There's a TV show that once in a while my family will watch. Maybe you've seen it. It's called Cake Wars. So they have to make these cakes. And then there's always a section of it, at the end of it, where after they've completed it in the time that they had to do this, they have to move the cake to the judging table. As you can imagine, holy cow. There we go. Apparently the beginning can be just as dangerous as well. So you see, sometimes when they're moving something over, tragedy happens at the last minute. Or you've seen this, probably a football player running, has a breakaway, and just right at the end here, I don't know if, I'm going to have to switch clickers maybe here. There we go. Is dropping it right at just before crossing the line. Got all that way, and then they drop it. Or one other is maybe there's a runner who is celebrating a little bit too early. In this case, the guy from Oregon is celebrating, but the guy from Washington is passing him. And at the final light there. And, David Fee is happy with that picture, Washington beating Oregon. As the old saying goes, close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. And so you have to finish well, right? Now, what I want to do is I want to just look at three passages or three statements of Jesus here, really, in this, and show that Jesus, what he's doing here, is he's giving us a masterclass, really, on finishing well. He himself said this in John chapter 17, verse 4, earlier before what the text was read for us. He said in his high priestly prayer, he's praying to the Father, he says, I have glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. Jesus finished well here. And in the two passages that were read before us, there are several statements that are just very powerful. But what I want to do is I just want to look at three of them and just show and illustrate how Jesus finished well. So the first one is this one here in verse 36 of 18 is when he said, my kingdom is not of this world. You remember in this text here this is a conversation he's having with Pilate, and he's asking this question, if you're a king, and he said that he goes, am I a Jew? Your own nation, your chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? Jesus says, well, my kingdom is not of this world. And so really what we see here is that Jesus was showing that throughout his entire earthly ministry here, he didn't become distracted. He didn't become distracted by the world. Nothing could distract Jesus from accomplishing the Father's plan. And really the success of God's salvation plan here really hinged on Jesus' refusal to become distracted away from that plan. And one of the chief ways that he could have, or in what would be tempting to any of us, would be distracted by what the world has to offer. I mean, the temptation would have been there, right? I mean, Jesus had said things so many times, and people rejected him, and Jesus knew who he was. Jesus knew the truth about him, knew the truth about what his identity was and his abilities and his powers, because he is God. He is the second person of the Trinity, and he knew that, and yet people just rejected him. And people, they only saw him oftentimes as, isn't that just this the son of the carpenter? Is not this the one that we saw growing up here? And they rejected. In fact, we're told in the Gospels that it was his own hometown that rejected him. And even more so than that, even his half-brothers and sisters didn't believe in him during his earthly ministry. And so there was this temptation there he could have had to be right and to be recognized as right. Or just the temptation maybe to have peace in this life. Jesus' kingdom of not being in the world, it really complicated the peace that he could have had he shown his full might and power and made this world, his system, his kingdom. Maybe the temptation would have been to keep his loved ones out of harm's way. Jesus, if he would have made this world the source of his kingdom, his followers could have been in a much better situation. But you see, Jesus didn't get distracted by any of that. He didn't just get distracted by what people could have said would have been good things and the good that he could have accomplished, because he had the bigger plan in mind. And that was not just temporary peace, but the salvation of many, many souls. You see, Jesus, he finished well because he refused to be distracted by this world. He came to bring salvation to the world, not to be distracted by the world. And we faced similar distractions. You know, we're told that our citizenship as believers is in heaven. But how many times do we live as if our ultimate citizenship is here on earth? You see, Jesus, he finished well. This is the master class that he has. When he tells Pilate here, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. He's not being distracted. He's laser focused on doing the Father's will and the Father's plan. What a master class, and finishing well here. There's another statement here in chapter 19, verse 11. I like this interchange here. Pilate says to him, verse 10, you will not speak to me, because Jesus isn't responding to him. He says, you will not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? And what does Jesus say? He says, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. I would have loved to have been in that room when Jesus said that. I would have loved to see the look on Pilate's face. I would love to see the look on other people's faces as they hear Jesus say that to him. He says, I have the authority over you. And Jesus says, the only authority you have has been given to you from above. And what is he insinuating there? Because he's basically saying there, my Father is the one who gave you the authority you have. And do you really think that he's going to give you more authority than me? He's saying, you don't have authority. You think you do, but you don't. Now, let's be clear here. Jesus respected earthly authority. We know that from his teaching about paying taxes. We know that throughout his earthly ministry, he wanted to respect earthly authority. But as long as earthly authority stayed within their delegated area, in the areas where they were supposed to have authority and delegated authority, Jesus was not going to be, in this situation here, Jesus was not going to be bullied or intimidated when earthly authority stepped outside of their delegated sphere. So we see that Jesus, first of all, wasn't going to be distracted, but here he's not going to be intimidated. No matter who was standing before him, no matter the power that the person seemed to have, no matter the circumstances in the moment, Jesus was not going to recognize someone as having greater authority than the Father. Now, that temptation would have been real. I mean, put yourself in this situation. You're standing before somebody and think, man, they control my fate here. They control whether I live or they die in this moment. That's a lot of authority. They control whether or not how my loved ones are going to be treated. All these things would have been swimming around in our minds. And yet in Jesus, he's saying, I'm not going to be distracted, and I'm not going to be bullied, I'm not going to be intimidated. You see, Jesus, he never wavered in the truth that all authority on earth is given. It's not possessed. It is always subject to the supreme and sovereign will of our omnipotent God. Now think about this. I told you this is a masterclass in finishing well. And what we need to do is that we need to recognize that all the authority that we find ourselves under, and we do need to respect earthly authorities in their delegated sphere. But we need to always understand that the authority that they have is only delegated authority. That God is in control. That God is not going to be dethroned ever. I don't know about you, but sometimes I look around in the world and you start seeing how the world just seems to be so anti-God. Or you look around and you see the authorities and the figures of people in the positions of power in our country and other countries all over the world, and you think they have a lot of power to inflict good and evil on a lot of people. And sometimes it'd be easy to look to them as the authority, but here Jesus, in the final moments of his life, he always recognized where true authority was, and it's in the Father. And so if we're going to finish our lives well, if we're going to learn from this master class, as Jesus in the final moments of his life, we need to understand, whose authority do we live under? We live under God's authority. And that's going to inform the decisions that we make. That's going to keep us laser focused on following the scriptures and obeying Christ rather than being bullied or intimidated into following other leaders when they go away from the scriptures. And so Jesus here, he's saying, you don't have any authority at all. Can you imagine Pilate's reaction to that? Imagine that interchange. Now, I don't know. Pilate, he seemed to be one of these guys that he was in turmoil in this. I mean, we know from the narrative here that he really didn't even want to crucify Jesus. We know that his wife warned him about Jesus. We know that he washed his hands and said, okay, I'm not going to be guilty. You know that he knew that Jesus was innocent. And so for Jesus to stand there and say, your authority is only delegated, it had to be powerful. Before I move on, I'll just say this. Many of you and all of us in some way, shape, or form, we find ourselves in positions of authority as well. Maybe it's over children, maybe it's in a business. Never lose sight of the fact that any authority you have, or any authority that I have, is only delegated from the Father. And it should be used for his glory and his purposes alone. This is how we finish well. There's one more statement. I'm sure you could guess what it is. It's one word in the original language, and we translated, it is finished, verse 30. At the end here, Jesus, he's on the cross, and he says he thirsts to fulfill the scriptures. And so they bring sour wine there and put a sponge and give it up to him to drink. And I always wondered, that didn't sound very appealing, why they would give that to him. Well, that was the whole point. It was to further the torture. It was to make it that much more unbearable. And so when he says, I thirst, and it's fulfilling scripture, when he says that, and they give him this wine or vinegar, sour vinegar, and he puts that on his tongue, and it just makes it even worse. There's other effects that people sometimes, theologians look to about this, and they'll say that maybe that people did this is to kind of revive the person a little bit as well, if they're starting to lose their senses by them inhaling and tasting this vinegar. It would revive them a little bit so it would elongate the suffering. And here's what Jesus is going through. He's on the cross, and he's dealing with this. And then he comes to the point where it says, when we received, verse 30, the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. Jesus didn't fumble the ball on the 1-yard line. He was faithful all the way to the end. I told you it's one word in the original language. Telestai is the word there. And it literally means it's a statement of victory saying, it's accomplished, it's finished. And it was interesting here, it says that he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. That's written in such a way it's very precise. And what it means is, it means that death did not claim Jesus. He willingly surrendered his life to it. You see, he's the only human who ever lived that didn't have to experience death, but yet he willingly chose to do so. Now, the reason why I say he didn't have to is because we know from the scriptures, it says that for the wages of sin is death. We know that the payment of sin is death. We know that this is the reason why we have to experience death, or we know that the reason why as humans have to go through this is because sin entered into the world. Remember when Jesus back in the Garden of Eden, when God told Adam and Eve not to eat of the fruit, he says, in the day you eat of it, you'll surely die. They didn't know death before that. Death came as a result of sin. And death passed upon all men, for all have sinned, Romans chapter 5 says. And so that the only reason why we have to experience death is because we have our sin nature. But Jesus didn't sin. Jesus is perfectly righteous. Jesus had never committed any sin at all, so he did not have to taste death. But yet he willingly chose to do so. And it says he bowed his head and he gave up his Spirit. Now, we know that the temptation was there for him not to do this. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, remember when he was there praying and he's sweating great drops of blood and he's in toil, he's in anguish, and he's praying to the Father. And what does he say? He says, Father, if there be any other way, let it be so. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Remember when Jesus was in the wilderness at the beginning of his earthly ministry and Satan was tempting him, and he was basically saying, he says, if you bow down and worship me, I'm going to let everyone go, and I won't bother anyone, and I won't tempt anyone. He says, I'll just turn everything over to you. And it was a promise that it really wasn't Satan's to give, but yet he was doing this because he's a deceiver, and Jesus was not going to be duped by such deception because he's righteous and he's holy. He doesn't fumble the ball on the 1-yard line because he was faithful all the way to the end. He was faithful all the way until his very last breath. Talk about finishing well. So, what we can learn from this is that this is what Jesus did to accomplish what we need the most. Because if Jesus would have stopped, if Jesus would have fumbled this, if Jesus would have faltered here, then we would have no hope of salvation. If Jesus in the last moments leading up to the cross, if he would have said, it's too much, I cannot do it, and if he would have said, no, I'm not going to do this, our hope of eternity in heaven with him would be gone. We would be dead in our trespasses and sins. We would have no hope of forgiveness. But my friends, because Jesus was faithful until the end, because he went all the way to the end, and he was faithful all the way to the very last breath of his life, we can have forgiveness of sins. So good. So good. What a masterclass. I'm finishing well. And we need to do the same thing. Sprint across the finish line. None of us know how long we have on this life. Are we sprinting well? Are we sprinting across the finish line? Are we faithful to the end? You see, Jesus refused to be distracted. He refused to be intimidated, and he refused to fail here. This is our hope. No cakes were on the floor at the end. The ball was across the line, and he didn't give up and let a runner pass him at the end. You see, he perfectly finished his mission, which allows us to fulfill our purpose in life, to bring glory to God the Father. And he paved the way for even us to one day. He imagines one day it's possible for us to hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And that's only possible because Jesus was faithful. If Jesus wasn't faithful, we could have no way of hope of ever hearing that. But on this day, many years ago, Jesus was faithful until the end. And so we got to keep our eyes focused on him. We got to look unto Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, he despised the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God forever. And what helps us stay focused on Christ is this table right here. We have this Lord's Supper here, and it's a gift from God so that we can stay focused on Christ. It's a good reminder for us of what Christ has accomplished for us. The table reminds us that God's ultimate plan will be accomplished no matter how many times the enemy or earthly powers seek to disrupt his plan. It's going to be accomplished. And we get to celebrate that when we eat the bread and we drink the cup. Our success is wrapped in Jesus' accomplishments and his righteousness. If we're in Christ, then there's no failure there. Participating in the table allows us to renew our hope that comes from our union with Christ. And so in a minute here, we have this opportunity to come to the table and have the bread and have the juice and remember what Christ accomplished for us.